All right. Welcome to the Sustainability Strategy Summit. Today's interview is with Jane Elder, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Academy. Jane has a background in public policy, leadership, nonprofit management, and arts in Wisconsin. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, me too. I know we've had some preliminary, just fascinating conversations. So I'm really excited to talk through what you and the Academy are up to today. So can you tell the listeners what the Climate and Energy Initiative is at the Academy and what are its major priorities?
Okay. So we started the Climate and Energy Initiative, which in-house we call CNE. So if I revert to that, that's what I'm talking about. In 2012, and it was in response to what we saw as a gap in leadership in Wisconsin in the climate and energy space. Our initiatives are collaborative efforts. We pull together leaders from a whole variety of sectors who have expertise, who have, in a sense, a stakeholder role in an issue, who are people who will be affected by these decisions. We gather people from lots of sectors, bring them together through a collaborative process to talk through what are the issues, what are the sources of the challenges, how might we solve them, who can solve them, how long might this take, is this actionable and practical, is this a pipe dream. We work through a really set just sort of rigorous conversations on who knows what do we know from this information, what are the gaps. It's sort of a problem analysis process and also a solution and strategy identification process. It's a little think tanky, but we think they're pretty grassrootsy kinds of groups. And so we started this initiative. Like I said, we felt there was a real gap in Wisconsin, and we used the models that we've used for Waters at Wisconsin and the Future of Farming and Rural Life to look at a long-term challenge and what could be long-term solutions. So back in 2012, we got started, and one of the first conversations we had was Wisconsin does not have a long-term energy plan, and it does not have a climate plan. And we thought that was a problem.
An opportunity, right?
And we saw what was happening in many other states so much farther along in, where do we want to be with our energy sources in 20 years? How will climate affect us? And what do we want to do to prepare for that? Do we want to be part of the solutions, or do we want to sit back and watch and hope somebody else figures this out? And so we brought together people who were working on energy policy, energy efficiency, people working in transportation, people who had worked for utilities, people who had worked in government, folks who were both scientific and technical experts in the space, nonprofit advocacy groups. Everybody had a different perspective to bring to the process. But early on, this notion, there is no game plan. How do we create a framework for one? What needs to be in a plan? We knew we didn't have the technical expertise to do, a full-blown energy plan, and that's the Public Service Commission's job. But we wanted to do, what's the framework? What needs to be in this plan? What would a healthy plan look like? And so roughly 2 years into the effort, we took those preliminary ideas and published it in a report called Climate Forward. And what we did in Climate Forward was to look at what we called the pathways for progress at the time. And they will feel very familiar to people today, I think. One of the areas is where can we improve in energy efficiency and conservation? Another one was what is the opportunity in renewables? And back in 2012, we were really losing ground to so many other states in the renewable space. So solar, wind, other types of renewable energy. What are we doing in transportation? What are we doing with it back then, which was this sort of new and exciting concept? What can we do with land-based carbon storage? It's what nature has been doing all along, and how do we learn from that, and what are the opportunities in Wisconsin? And then probably for me, the wonkiest, but I think perhaps one of the most important things, what do we do about the business models and structures through which we generate energy and deliver it to consumers? And how is that old model working or failing? And what are the alternatives? Which is a complex headspace for me. But we were working with a lot of people who are actually very fluent in that whole space. So looking at things like the grid, and concepts that back then, this whole notion of stranded assets and who pays. So the financial strategies, the structural systems such as the grid, and the whole governance system around that, very complex but really essential to long-term strategies. And what was Wisconsin's role in that? So the roadmap touched on all of those. We also sought to identify what we called the vanguard. Who's out there already in Wisconsin, because we knew they were, right? Who's all out there, part of the solutions already, and how can we tell their stories? So we looked at businesses, we looked at municipalities, we looked at who's doing something exciting that shows that Wisconsin is leading in this space. So stories such as Gunderson Health System and their objectives to become a net zero organization, Quick Trip, what it was doing with their fleets and transportation systems and efficiencies there. And then cities like Milwaukee, things they were doing from neighborhood energy strategies to what their long-term opportunities might be in solar and renewables. So that was the whole roadmap effort. And we cataloged it, if you will, and shared it through workshops and such. But we realized the work certainly was not done. And so the next steps were, how do we track progress on these recommendations? And then how can we help leverage opportunity? So the other things we've done in the Climate Energy Initiative were to look at what is actionable, what has traction now. There was a pretty clear understanding that at the time, there was limited leadership at the federal level and parallel limited leadership in state government. So where was the leadership? So we saw it in two key sectors. One, the entrepreneurial business sector, and also in local governments. And so for 4 years, we hosted a series of local government summits where we brought together mayors, sustainability officers, people working on city councils, League of Municipalities, Counties Association, because local governments have to pay the local bills. And everything from the street lighting costs to just city operations, they understood the cost of energy, and they understood that there were benefits to more efficient systems and to sharing knowledge with each other. So through those local government summits, we were able to bring together community leaders to really share and do a lot of peer-to-peer learning. They were fun events, and just hearing somebody say, wait a minute, you just changed the way the garage door closes on your fire department and you saved how much? Because in Stevens Point, the fire trucks were heading out in the winter, and they did not have a sufficient automatic closing system to keep the firehouse from chilling out. So just a simple little thing like those kinds of efficiency things. Or, what did it take for your city to shift to LED lights? How much did that cost you? Were you able to get federal support? So all that kind of stuff. And collaboration and sharing is a big part of how we do the initiatives. We've also done a little bit of work. We had our first Business Leaders Summit this fall virtually. And so exciting to hear the excitement among big business leaders who want to be in the leadership space, right? Who want to be entrepreneurial and are proud of the work they're doing. And it's not just out of the goodness of their heart, which is a good thing. It's because it makes good business sense. Right? And so finding ways to help those leaders find each other and tell their stories. Because again, in the global competitive marketplace, if you're not aware of how other businesses across the world are grappling with these things, you're really behind the curve and sometimes behind in the competitive space. So it's exciting to see those sectors moving forward. I think we're beginning to see opportunities in government, obviously, with what's happening with federal strategies and the governor's task force here in Wisconsin. But that's the idea behind these initiatives. How do we create a space for collaboration that can be a springboard for other collaborations? How do we take emerging ideas, bring them to the forefront so people can say, that could work here, or we need change in this place. So that's a long explanation of how these initiatives work Nobody gets paid except our staff. Thank you, staff. So these are all volunteer efforts from people who are very, very busy doing their own work in their own sector, who have stepped up to say, I can be part of larger solutions. And to be in a room full of people who are willing to do that is one of the most satisfying things I've ever done. So
Mm.
that's why I
Yeah.
love the initiatives.
Yeah. Wow. Having lived in Wisconsin for about a decade, again, I mean, I was born here and I have a design background. So like, this is so fascinating to me because it's taking my designer mind in systems thinking to a whole nother level, right? To the streetlights in our community. And sustainability is successful when we all participate, right? And that's true inside of a business, that's true inside of our communities, that's true inside our governments. And so I think what you're doing and bringing people together for these cross collaboration type of efforts really is sort of where the rubber meets the road with the work that we, I mean, businesses want and need to hear from other businesses, and they're really willing usually to collaborate inside of the space around sustainability. And we have a lot to learn in support of the larger efforts, right? So I think what you're up to and have been doing in the state is really unique and important and necessary.
Thanks. We have felt it's important too, and just for full transparency, it's a modest grant-funded program, right? That's how we do this work. But we've been thrilled to be able to be in this space, and it's people talk about what is what do climate solutions look like? Well, a lot of it is deep and important conversations. That's what change looks like,
That's where it
and
starts.
it's building trust, and it's also putting a face and a person behind leadership and behind change. And um, uh, I am remembering the first time we had Jeff Thompson from Gunderson talk about what they were trying to achieve. And I watched how people clustered around him after because they just wanted to hear more. But here was a real person taking real risks, and they have taken real risks to do this work. And he was confident in their vision and their strategy. And you could just see people going, okay, you can do this. You can do this. We can do this in Wisconsin. And that's how climate change solutions happen.
Absolutely. It's those leaders that are willing to take a step up and make a strong stand for doing something. In the case of Gunderson, like, it seems somewhat obvious, right? Like, our health is directly impacted by our environment. So hospitals taking a stronger stand for reducing pollution in the air from burning fossil fuels, doesn't that make sense? And it just takes these bold leaders willing to lead organizations through figuring that change out and figuring out, I think of that silly analogy of government in how are we going to get to the moon? Well, we're going to do it by this day and we'll figure it out. And it's like setting the intent, having the willingness to figure it out. And I feel like as a state, I've seen this progress happen, and I see it in business every day. Yes, it's important to figure out the tactics and how you're going to achieve it, but you have to be willing to commit before you can figure it out. So
it's that old light bulb joke, the psychiatrist, how do you get a patient to change his mind instead of or change a light bulb, right? And the first thing is they have to want to do it.
yeah.
So if you want to be part of the solutions, then it's an open door to being part of that conversation. And there's nothing. Climate change is a huge, complex, challenging problem. But there are steps we can take, and there are meaningful things we can do, and it's if you look at it as insurmountable, it will remain insurmountable. If you look at what can we do now, what can we do in 10 years, what's urgent to do now, who can we work with to do this, it's a different approach to a really challenging problem.
Yeah. So from your perspective, where is the initiative today, but also, how can businesses participate in some of these solutions going forward in Wisconsin? Are there particular opportunities they could be looking for?
Well, there's so many, and I'll go back to the pathways, right? So many businesses, again, because of bottom line issues, right? Energy costs money and waste
Mhm.
costs too. So many businesses have stepped into lots of work on energy efficiency and energy conservation, from the design of building to the process decisions, right? How we make something or how we deliver something. All of those involve energy choices, and so being smart and strategic about how energy is used. um, we have businesses who are certainly, we're seeing the renewable business itself. Solar is taking off in Wisconsin, and many businesses are interested in that space, and many of them are interested in solar energy for themselves or being part of a distributed system. And so being open to renewables as a as a business strategy. I mentioned, one of the vanguards we pulled out was Quick Trip on Transportation. Transportation seems to be overlooked a lot in climate conversations, and yet it's so important. And how we move products, even things like how we move water. Moving water is one of the most energy intensive things we can do. So thinking about moving people, moving products, moving even water through systems. So what does our transportation future look like in the business community? Um, uh, and even I think there's business opportunities as we look at the land-based carbon storage. An enormous amount of Wisconsin's forest land is corporately owned. Let's have a conversation
Oh,
about the
interesting.
next generation of
Mhm.
those corporate forest lands. And even on corporate campuses, are there ways you can do demonstration sites of good land use decision making? So there's a lot of opportunities across the board. Um, and looking at business models, right? That's the very beginning of how do we do our business? Why do we do it? Who benefits? Does it make sense to be a B Corp as opposed to all those kinds of decisions influence where they are in the sort of sustainability spectrum and ways that they can contribute to climate solutions. And we're always open to having conversations with people who are interested in participating in the various uh, uh, areas we're focusing on from any given time. Our current work at the Academy is heading in a couple directions. One, we are hoping to host in October this year a virtual local governments conversation again, probably in October. We're catching our breath today, just having had a big briefing on critical lands yesterday, but we are hoping to do that in October. We are planning in early 2022 to pull together a different kind of leadership summit. We would like to meet with the leadership from the community-led organizations, people who are doing work in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their cities, not the public officials, but the groups on the ground who are trying to do sustainability work in their communities, because we think there are connections between the dots, from a group working in Milwaukee to groups that are working in rural Wisconsin. Um, and how can we pull that energy together, help them discover what they've got in common, and learn from them the solutions that they're advancing. So we're hoping to do that probably in February. And I'm very excited in the fall of 22, I believe it's October 17th, save the date, we will be convening the second Climate Fast Forward Conference, CFF 2.0 is what we're calling it. This will be at Monona Terrace. We anticipate another large state conference about the scale or larger of the one we hosted in 2019, to take a really hard look at what kind of progress are we making, what's the next generation of opportunities, who's in the leadership space. And at that point, we anticipate we'll be showcasing some of the work that we have put some intense effort into in this last year, and will again this coming year, on natural climate solutions, the land-based solutions in Wisconsin. So that's the spectrum. But I'm
Great.
very excited. We have a second year of funding to carry forward this work on natural climate solutions, and we'll be really digging into policy levers. How do we make it easier for people who want to do natural climate solutions um, to do this without having to deal with a lot of barriers in the policy arena right now?
Awesome. So just for listeners, I'm going to say in the email that we send this out, I'm going to include a list of those ways that you can get involved in these conversations through the Academy. So
Right.
those will be linked in your email. I just also, Jane, for those listening who might not understand what we mean by natural capital solution,
Natural carbon solutions, yes.
natural
Well,
carbon
and some
solution.
people call it natural capital, but that's a different
That
pathway.
is, yes. And so can you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. As I said when we started, nature has been storing carbon in the soils and in trees since the primordial soup. Well, a little bit after primordial soup. But as natural systems have evolved, one of the ways that carbon cycles in the Earth biosphere and in the atmosphere is through uh, carbon that gets stored in the soils. We call this, people talk about rich earth or black soil. That's the carbon-rich soils. We also store carbon in trees, and most of the fiber in wood, right, is how the process of photosynthesis has turned this into, it's stored it in the wood of trees. And so the question is, how can we optimize what nature can do? How do we help nature do its job and give it more room, more space, more opportunity to do this well? So our project has been looking across the Wisconsin landscape, sort of where are the best places to do this, what makes sense for various kinds of landscapes, and then how do you encourage people to manage their lands in ways that will keep carbon in the soil or in the trees. The short version is, in our part of the world, the forests of the Great Lakes region, particularly the ones with good rich soils, the mesic soils, lots of moisture, are one of the best sort of subcontinental or mid-continental carbon sinks in North America. And so a healthy forest is a really great place to keep carbon in the trees and in the soils. And so that's a huge opportunity. And the question is, how do we manage forests that meet the multiple needs that are currently sought from the forests of the Midwest in ways that optimize their ability to keep carbon tied up in healthy trees and in healthy soils. Wisconsin also has an enormous amount of agricultural land. And while the comparative benefits, forests are your best option, but doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing the best we can with agricultural soils to keep what we can in agricultural soils, because among other things, most practices that are good for carbon storage are also good for water quality, and they're good for flood prevention, and they're good for natural habitat and biodiversity. So our project will be, we're looking at a variety of things, from where are the lands, and there's some pretty good mapping already in place, but where are the optimal ones, which ones need special protection, which ones are threatened by development, by invasive species. There's a whole range of threats to the places that are already doing lots of good work for us, but you can't take this for granted. So the idea is to identify the best and optimal places, identify good practices that will protect these, and even consider some sites for very significant long-term protection. And there's a lot of work going on sort of what's optimal in the growth cycle of a forest. And for the short term, in the next 10 years, the real urgent need is to protect the forests that are doing the work now. And reforestation, it will be part of a longer term plan, but we've got really important lands that are doing the work now. With wetlands, the research is coming along. It's not quite as far as advanced as it is in forests, but wetlands are also, particularly the forested wetlands, are among the most significant places we can naturally store carbon in the landscape. And as we all know, in the Midwest, wetlands protection has been a battle for 50 to 100 years, and that battle wages on. So we're excited again to be in this collaborative space. We've brought together scientists, people from state agencies, people from organizations like the Nature Conservancy, and one of the key themes coming out of this work is, yes, it's important to look at these from a carbon sequestration and storage standpoint. But in any living landscape, you also need to look at the co-benefits for the full ecosystem and for the communities, the social benefits. So social, cultural, ecological, all that's part of it, and you can't sort of separate carbon from the rest of the human and the natural ecosystem.
And I think this is important for businesses for so many reasons, right? Just from thinking about from a mindset of both and, right? We don't have to have our lands or our businesses. We can have both, right? And we talk so many times to businesses about, calculating their carbon footprint. Businesses are carbon consumers. We're, emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And so many businesses today are in the conversation of how can they reduce their carbon? How can they offset their carbon? What are ways that they can, become carbon neutral, carbon negative, net zero? These are all terms in the marketplace today. And right here in Wisconsin, we have that opportunity, like you're saying, through our forests to potentially create some sort of system where, we're focusing on storing and returning the carbon back to the land, back to the soil, taking it out of the atmosphere. And this is an important opportunity for businesses to either support, to, financially and or through potential system of offsets or something of the sort. So thank you for explaining that, Al. I think personally, I find it incredibly fascinating. Yeah.
It's complicated. There's already a lot of interest, right, in this notion of carbon offsets. And the question is, do you get your own house in order before you let somebody else get your offset? So there's a lot of questions there. But there may also be opportunities for, business opportunities around monetizing natural carbon storage in Wisconsin. One of the things I think might be exciting is incentives for landowners. And this is where we get into some of these systems things right now. So much of agricultural policy drives the way we farm and the choices we make in crops and such. But imagine if it was more profitable for a landowner to sequester carbon than to grow corn, right? And somewhere somebody's just fainted. But be careful about this. But what if it makes more sense from a family business standpoint to be compensated in some way to have a healthy forested wetland on your land, and to protect that as opposed to plow it under to try to plant a row crop. So this is all new territory, right? And it's part of the dynamic world we're going to be in of having to find rapid solutions in a short timeline. We're going to be in a very entrepreneurial space. I'm sure there will be mistakes along the way. But what is exciting is people are thinking about things in very different ways in different contexts. To get back to this concept of sustainability, the exciting thing is to imagine solutions that are good for people, right, and their bottom line, but are also good for the environment and create a healthy future for generations to come. And I think, I don't want to be all Pollyanna about this, but I think there are really great opportunities for win-win opportunities, win-win solutions, but it means letting go of some of our assumptions about the way things are, and that's hard for people, and so it's going to be a fascinating decade ahead as the world scrambles to try to find the best ways to grapple with climate change. And if we're smart, if we're collaborative, if we share, if we help each other, we'll be a lot farther along than if we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to ask a question just about, again, how do you see maybe a small business? I mean, this makes sense in my mind for a lot of larger businesses, like you said, that maybe own own corporations that own forest land, or that are ahead on tracking and managing carbon. Are there any thoughts for small businesses in Wisconsin on how they can participate in climate solutions?
So much I think depends on the kind of business, but one is, making sure you've got your own carbon footprint sorted out. And that might be your supply chain. If you're a t-shirt shop, where are they coming from, and where was the cotton sourced, and how long did it take to ship it to you, and what happens when the consumer is done with this product. So looking at those sort of supply chain and life cycle of whatever your business is providing. Also modeling practices that you want either your customers or your community to know about you. Whether it's whether it's having the compost bin next to the trash in the back alley, but there's just a lot of steps like that. I think also being open that you're part of branding your business is that you're a climate forward business, or you want to be seen as a sustainable business. So part of the organizational branding, saying the story, I want to be in this space, I'm part of a climate solution. And then understanding how the money works, right? If you're spending a massive amount on your electrical bills, then part of your business model is that we're willing to spend all this on fossil fuel. So all of those choices, every business choice has an environmental and a sustainability story behind it. And we were just back at the office yesterday, creeping back in, and we were toasting with a leftover bottle of champagne from our gala, which one of three left from our last moment of having a grand 2020. And we had a discussion about whether or not we could use the plastic cups. But that's the kind of organization that we are, and you don't want to get down into the micromanagement, but being aware that every decision may or may not have an environmental impact from, like I said, where you source your products. We've seen so many things now. The massive online businesses. What's the shipping footprint, right? And just because something can be recycled, is this community actually recycling it? I understand there's a tremendous opportunity in cardboard boxes, right? Based on where we've been through the pandemic. So everything from how was it made, who made it, who benefited, who didn't, how will the consumer use this, where will it end up in the end? And if you're service-based businesses, in the services that you're providing, where's the sustainability deliverable in that? Is it helping the organization be more aware of something? Is it explaining, I'd rather do this over Zoom rather than drive 200 miles to meet with you? All those questions, again, lots of little decisions every day add up to big impacts over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to ask one last question, which might be a big question for the last question, but I just know you have a interest and some background in overall systems change. And really, to me, that's what sustainability is about. We're trying to look at how our systems are interacting and change them to more sustainable regenerative models. So can you share with us what is needed to change things at the system level, and how can we as sustainability professionals contribute?
Wow. Well, if we had another 6 hours.
That might be a whole nother interview.
I think within climate and energy and sustainability, a couple big things. One, I think we need to look at this concept of energy and climate democracy. Who gets to make the decisions, right? So as I'm assuming you and I are both consuming electricity at the moment. Let me drink here for a second. We never really got to vote on the kind of electricity that we were going to get, how it was going to be generated, whether it was going to come from a coal plant or an alternative or renewable source. Nobody asked me if I wanted to pay for a 30-year build out of a coal plant. That system is pretty opaque to most of us. We pay the bills, right? That's our role in the system. Pay the bills and pay them on time. There are ways to intervene, but they're really complicated. And we were having a conversation on this, and I said, so if an individual citizen wanted to influence the Public Service Commission, what would they need to do? And the laughter around the table was an indication of how hard this is. And somebody said, well, they need 3 $500 an hour lawyers first. That's not really very democratic. So most of us have not historically, in the way our energy systems and the governing structures around them are set up, had much of an ability to influence these long-term, very expensive, and very environmentally important decisions. And most of us don't have those lawyers. So how do we democratize the long-term decisions around these things is one of the areas where I think system change is really important. Even, you know, the lawsuits about who can have solar power on their roof and who can sell it back, and the protection of the monopoly, if you will, also doesn't feel very democratic to me. So asking big questions about who decides, how is it that you got this decision-making power? Can anybody change that? Who can change that? That's where these structures and systems make it really, really difficult to have nimble change. That concept of distributed energy, right? Having localized sources of electricity generation. So exciting in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of renewability and resilience in the system. A long, long structural challenge to how do you take a hard grid with a very deep embedded system of management and governance. How would you change that? And how do you do it equitably, and who gets to decide? So the structures and systems and governance around energy decision-making in a democracy, big questions are out there. And then also, as we look at just our ability to have efficacy, who gets to decide what is sustainable? Who gets to decide what the trade-offs are? And right now, I think a lot of us feel like many people are disenfranchised in the current democracy, and many voices are not heard. And we have been at such a stalemate in policy for so long. We need to take a good look at our democratic structures that are standing in the way of collaboration in government. When we started the Climate Energy Project, I had a colleague who said, well, you know, isn't this what our state government should be doing? Looking at these long-term solutions. And I said, sure. Do you see that happening? Give me the evidence that it's happening. And when we stepped into that space, somebody said, well, this is quasi-governmental. And I said, I think that's a bit of a reach from this somewhat informal collaboration. But we need to be able to work with each other across partisan divides. We need to be able to understand and use the science. So we have some fragile and broken things in our primary governing systems, whether it's how decisions are made or who gets to make them, to who has a voice. And I think we've seen for so long, the structures and the systems are designed to favor the big and the powerful. I was having a conversation about PFAS, right? The water pollutant. And I was involved in water quality issues back in the 80s and 90s. And one of the things we pushed hard for in the Clean Water Act amendments, and it didn't happen, and in the binational treaties, was the notion of the precautionary principle, and not allowing corporations to put things out into the marketplace until we knew they were not going to cause harm, not going to bioaccumulate, not going to be, you know, carcinogenic or have any other high risk factors. And with the changes in the American government in the 90s and the role of corporate citizens, the role of corporate power, the precautionary principle just didn't get across the threshold with environmental regulation in the United States. And so now when people are saying, why did PFAS happen? It was predictable, tragically predictable. And there are probably more chemicals like that out there. We just haven't either looked yet or haven't found them. So that says to me, at the systems level, there's something wrong with the structures and something wrong in the power dynamics that allow these things to keep happening. And I think a few final thoughts. If we want to work with nature, and many of us do, we need to understand that nature does not care about political compromise. Nature does not negotiate. The laws of physics and biology do not negotiate. And so we might say we need another 30 years to deal with climate change, but the laws of physics in the atmosphere and the cycling of carbon are not going to sit at the table and say, sure, I can make that happen. And I'm always amazed at the human hubris that thinks somehow, if it's inconvenient for our timeline, we can reshape nature to make this work out for us. And so, again, the way our governing structures work, there's so much is uncompromised, at least it used to be. Nature has a very different set of rules, and we need systems that work with instead of against the natural systems. And for me, that's the true challenge of sustainability. How do we develop social systems? How do we develop economic systems that recognize and work in partnership with ecological systems and energy transfer and nature, all those sorts of things? And then we have a very exciting future. Mm-hmm. And so when we expect nature to come along to the bargaining table, so far, we have very few examples, if any, that is an efficient approach to decision making. So that's the kind of system level thinking I think long-term we need to do if we really want to reach a compatible relationship between human systems and natural systems.
Absolutely. So last quick follow-up. If somebody's interested in more about this, I think you have some great resources. Is there just, one or two things that somebody can do either in their business or on their own in terms of engaging in this type of thinking or conversation?
Yeah, I think, the classic work on this is Donella Meadows' work on ways to intervene in a system. And that was written in the 1990s, but still, I think, very relevant to where we are now. There's a consulting group that has put out you can find it on YouTube, The Water of Systems Change, which is the notion being that if you're a fish swimming in the ocean, you don't actually perhaps know that you're in water. But water is where a lot of the changes happen in the system. So being aware of the water in which we are swimming, I think, is the metaphor there. And then for a simple and practical approach that I'm really excited about, and full disclosure, my husband works for the Wisconsin River Alliance. They are working on a project called the Water Agenda, which is looking at how would you reshape governing systems around water if you took into account things such as the way water works in nature. If you looked at who gets to make decisions and how those decisions are made. And we find ourselves, 50 plus years after the Clean Water Act, which was a remarkable achievement for a democratic society. But we also have to acknowledge that parts of it just don't work. And we wouldn't be having algal blooms in our local lakes if it really worked, right? And so even treasured planks of the American regulatory platform, they tend to become part of that water that we're swimming in that we don't see. And we need to be able to step back and say, even the beloved framework isn't enough, not in 2021. So if it's not, what might be. So those are some of the examples, but I think the water agenda is a really exciting way to sort of unpack where are we at this point in our history with trying to regulate and have a, how do we get to clean water and sustainable water in our society, and just say maybe there are different strategies. Maybe there are different strategies, and they're not particularly exotic. It's how does nature work, or how does water work in nature, and were the affected people involved in decision making over a long-term horizon. And those are just a couple. They have, I believe, 11 or 12 points. So I'll encourage people to go to their website and look for the water agenda. So once you've played in the systems place, you will not, I hope, go back. It's important, some of the work is incremental. Some of it is just painstakingly, boringly incremental progress every day. But at a certain point you go, we've been doing this for 30 years or 50 years, and transformational change has not happened. And I think that's worth looking at. The Yahara 2020 project that Chris Kucharik and Steve Carpenter worked on also plays with some of these ideas of what could be transformational change. And they used a scenarios process to sort of pull people out of their comfort zones. Anyway, I find it fun. I find it intriguing, and I also find it very practical and useful. And I also love the joke that nobody in the late Middle Ages knew that things like the Enlightenment or the Renaissance were coming. And yet they came because there were little change agents, and maybe sometimes some big ones. So transformation is quite possible. And I think in climate change solutions, and with the size of population we have on Earth right now, we're going to need transformational changes. So who knows what the next great will be.
Yes.
But anyway, so
Well,
I urge people to play in that sandbox. It's a lot of it's both fun, but I think it's also a good strategic place to work.
Absolutely. And I think it's so relevant for businesses and sustainability professionals together to really be reminded that the day-to-day pragmatic work matters, and to not give up on it at the same time we're working towards bigger systems change. So it's a both and, right? It's to look at it from this big systems perspective, as well as what can you do day in and day out in your organization, for your organization, and even on a personal level. So thank you so much, Jane, for being here. Thank you for your time and insight. I find it wonderful, and for all the work the Academy is doing. And again, we will link all the stuff Jane was talking about in the email, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Jessie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.